We are starting a new trial today. It's day one. It started this morning. There's a lot of talking going on. So I actually think we're going to catch up pretty fast. But we're going to watch this until Monica Cementelli's trial comes on. That will be at 1 o'clock when we switch over to that. But I actually saved myself because I got interrogation video and I was getting it all ready. And then I made the connection that is this the trial that's happening right now for one of these women? And yes, it is. So this is all good. The interrogation video I will post later tonight, but it has to do with this trial. So I'm going to read you just a little bit about it so you have just the headlines and know what we're looking at getting started for it. But it is: two women were accused of murder and arson in connection with the house fire last month, but this was in 2021. Stacy Rodriguez, 19, and Hosanna Varela, 23, are both facing charges of first-degree murder, arson, burglary, and tampering with evidence after a man's body was found inside the charred home. This was on October 6, 2021, so it's been quite a while. And Stacy Rodriguez, her trial started today. So we're going to go ahead and start watching it. I have it all teed up, ready to go. I'll move myself to the corner. And we will most likely get pretty far into it since we can skip their breaks before Monica's comes on. Okay.
Next, the prosecution will offer evidence. Evidence is what the witnesses say under oath and items allowed as exhibits. After the prosecution's evidence, the defense may present evidence but is not required to do so. I want to remind you that the defendant is presumed to be innocent. The prosecution must prove the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant does not have to prove their innocence or call any witnesses or introduce any evidence. After the evidence has been presented, I will tell you the rules of law which you must use in reaching your verdict. These rules of law are called jury instructions. I will read them to you, and you will be allowed to take them with you to the jury room during your deliberations. It is my job to decide what rules of law apply to the case. You must
I'm going to
follow
skip
all
through
of
the
the
jury
rules as I explain them to
instruction.
you.
We
You
hear
cannot
enough of
follow
those.
some and ignore others. Even if you disagree or do not understand the reasons for some of the rules of your oath. Do not attempt to gather any information on your own. Do not read or research about this case or this kind of case from any other
That is
source,
Stacy
including
Rodriguez.
the internet. Many of us routinely use the internet to research topics of interest, but you may not do that in this case. You may not use Google, Bing, or any other type of internet search engine to learn about any person, place, or thing that is involved in this case.
Good morning. You're here because what she did. You're here because of what she did on October 3rd, 2021. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear a lot of facts. You're going to be asked to use your reason and your common sense to filter through it and render a just verdict. And you're all equipped to do that. But there's a famous quote that will help in that process, help in your process. And that's, let us take things as we find them. Let us not attempt to distort them into what they are not. We cannot make facts. All our wishing cannot change them. We must use them. And you will use the facts. And the facts are that on October 3rd, 2021, Christopher Dickerson was viciously and violently murdered in an unnecessary and unjustifiable way. And you're going to hear that law enforcement was dispatched to his home that he had purchased earlier that year by his neighbors as they called, afraid that he was there, afraid that he was inside. And you're going to see the response from police as they get on scene. This is Officer Flores, Greeley PD. Is anyone in there? That answer is a resounding yes. That person that was in there is why we're here. That person that was in there was Christopher Dickerson. He was a son. He was a friend to many.
Objection, invoking sympathy.
All right, the court will overrule the objection.
He was a colleague. He loved animals. He loved his dog.
Renewing our objection.
All right, Mr. Praley, if you'll move on, please.
And his life, taken by her hands, is why we are here. And ladies and gentlemen, the way his life was taken is going to be tough for you to see.
Objection, invoking sympathy.
All right, the court will I'm sorry, did you get a record of that, Sheriff? Okay, the court will overrule the objection.
But it's the way it was. It's the way it is. And you're going to hear that Christopher Dickerson was burnt beyond recognition. He was burnt so badly that he had to be identified in part by his dental records. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not as it first seems. Because Christopher Dickerson on October 3rd, 2021, was not killed by that fire. He was killed by a process of vicious and violent force. And you'll hear on the autopsy that it was noted that there was a particular thing coming out of his neck. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear that that was a metal file. You're going to get to see it. And it had a handle on it. And you're going to get to see that the pointy part sticking out would be where the handle was.
Objection, facts not in evidence. Can we approach?
Sure.
A lot of objections in this opening statement already. If you want my best guess, Jeffrey, I'm going to say it won't even go a week. But since today's Thursday, maybe we'll wrap up Tuesday or Wednesday next week. Believe she is not out on bond, but I'll double check that right now. She is not on bond. She was denied. Well, she wasn't denied. Her bond was 1 million and they asked to have it lowered and they said no. So she is still in.
May I proceed?
Yes, please.
And so the pointy part sticking out of Mr. Dickerson's neck, you'll hear in regards to a likely handle that had broken off or burnt off. And that the blunt part of this file was plunged into the victim's neck not once. What you're looking at would have been the last one. It stayed in his neck. It's the only thing that makes sense. But what you'll hear from Dr. Burson, an objective pathologist or county coroner, is that he notes there are 5 separate and distinct stab wounds in Chris's neck. And you will be asked to consider that using reason and common sense. Plunging a piece of metal with such force into a neck and taking it out. Into the neck and taking it out. Back in, back out, back in, back out, back in. All in the neck region. All in a place directed at a person where you know there are arteries trying to kill. And you'll hear specifically through Dr. Burson that the carotid artery was hit. And that will be depicted by Dr. Burson. And he will opine what that would mean and how that's a bloodletting process and how much blood that would take and the coagulation in that area and the trauma. And you'll get to see the object, and the blunt end is what's going in his neck. And you'll get to think about that using reason and common sense when you're deciding murder in the first degree. And you're to consider all the evidence in light of your observations and experience in life. That's why you were selected. Now, a lot of this is not going to be a difficult decision as to me meeting my elements for you at all. And so we're going to go through that very quickly. But I, again, have to prove that the defendant in the state of Colorado at or about the date and place charge of October 3rd. We'll talk about the mental state of after deliberation and intent and how that corresponds with self-defense and specifically causing the death of Christopher Dickerson. And Dr. Burson will testify for you extensively. 5 stab wounds. 5 distinct stab wounds. He will opine that the cause of death was sharp force injuries to the neck and that the manner of death was homicide. Now keep in mind this autopsy takes place a day or two after they discover Chris being burnt that severely. Nearly 100% of his body is burnt. But you're going to get the whole picture in this case, the totality of the circumstances, the facts that you need to determine what a person was thinking when they were acting. Not just then, but total. That's going to be your job. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to get to compare that if and when you receive self-defense. And you're going to get to think, is that reasonable? Is that necessary? Does that make sense? Those will be the questions you are asking of yourself and others, particularly as to her actions on that day. So immediately after, Chris is stabbed 5 times in a close region in his neck. You'll get to hear what happened after. And to be very clear, the investigation took a different path, which I'm going to get into for you, as to how we get here, so that you understand why we're here today specifically with her. Okay? And so what you're going to hear is that when officers got to that residence after that fire and pull Chris's burnt body out, there's a lot of things that start making very little sense. And specifically, they go to the bedroom. And they see all these things laid out on a bed. You will get to decide if you think Chris lived that way or not. Okay? Well, what you'll get to see is that there's a particular item, a jewelry box, opened on the bed from Zales. And you'll get to see when those items are taken away, this void. You'll hear from experts in fire describing that, well, it's pretty obvious when you look at this picture, you can tell what was there at the time the fire was started and what wasn't based on the different coloring. And that's October 3rd. That's what they notice. And so shortly around that time, the victim's father, Alan Dickerson, after he's notified about his son, and after being introduced to the Greeley Police Department, that they're investigating these circumstances, being introduced to Mr. Burroughs, Alan Dickerson starts providing assistance right away. And specifically, he helps him as a power of attorney for his son, helping with bank records, phone number, phone records, and Google location records. And you'll hear a lot about the Google location records. You'll hear from a lot of people that are much more tech savvy than probably you could imagine about your phones track a lot of things.
I'm sorry?
Objection, bolstering.
All right, the court will overrule the objection.
People who specialize in technology are going to come in and talk about if you have an Android device that's connected to Google, you might be sharing your location at a lot of places. Maybe you know that, maybe you don't. But all those things are provided, and specifically Alan Dickerson goes into his son's account. He downloads those records and those locations, and he provides them to Detective Burroughs. What does Detective Burroughs do? He starts following all of those things. He starts tracking movement. He starts ordering records. He starts obtaining surveillance, bank records, places, locations, movement of travel, all these things. Lots of sleepless nights. And what you're going to hear is that he's able to see that Chris, on that night, goes out to the bars downtown, right across the street. And you'll see Chris on the left And you'll see him talking to a female who's later identified as Dolores Vigil. And you'll see that she's discussing a phone, and there's going to be cameras at these places with times during these places, and he's using all of these things in conjunction with each other to figure out his location, his activities, and what he's doing, right? And so, for example, in People's Exhibit 81, you're going to hear that at the time of this exchange that's on camera, where there's this number that Investigator Burroughs, or Detective Burroughs, I apologize, that he's looking at the phone records, the movement, the surveillance, and he's able to see, okay, Chris and Dolores, their phones are connecting. He's able to say that I see him on camera, and he's able to track him and what he's doing, his movement. And ultimately, he follows him around downtown Greeley, and he sees Chris leaving on People's Exhibit 88. And he's looking for clues. And he sees this interaction from surveillance on People's 88. Now there's video. Not all video is going to be published. But there's this interaction with this silver Malibu and these distinct rims. And he sees this, and he puts that among things to look into. And he goes through all the other surveillance. And he then tracks back, who are those people in the silver Malibu? What do they look like? What's that car? All those types of things. And when he tracks all the way back, it comes to two people, two females. And he goes through this process, and he's able to say that the defendant is wearing the black. She's got this visor on. She's got her hair up in a bun. And this other individual is Hosanna Varela. And again, that process takes a lot of time of figuring out their specific names. But he knows that these individuals, based on their movement, are associated with that Malibu and that encounter that we just saw. And so what Detective Burroughs does is he keeps looking. And he sees that after this encounter, and after identifying those people, that Chris is heading home. We're walking away from the bars. And you'll get to see, maybe you recognize this, maybe you don't. It's going to be the window at the Rio right across the street. And you'll see Chris walk by it in Exhibit 90. And then right after that, you'll see that in dealing with that, there is a specific vehicle that's shown after Chris had walked by, and it's that Chevy Malibu. And then he's able to obtain surveillance that had been gathered in and around Chris's house on the early morning in question and the night before from 3 different neighbors, and he starts piecing this together, spending hours and hours of viewing this.
Bolstering.
All right, the court will overrule the objection.
And what you're going to hear is that Detective Burroughs was able to identify, based on a variety of things and corroborating it along the way, that when you saw Chris walking to his car, ultimately he drives home, he pulls into his garage, and after he gets home, that Chevy Malibu pulls into his driveway. And ultimately they go inside for a while, and you're going to hear, again, at that point, sometime later, that the defendant, Hosanna Varela, and Mr. Dickerson leave. Again, they come to the names of these individuals later. But they leave, and he's able to look at phone records. That Dolores Vigil that you previously saw at the bar exchanging phone numbers, that he goes, he leaves the house, and ultimately they're communicating, and they drive around, and ultimately he comes back. And you'll get to see surveillance footage that, remember, the Malibu had been parked in the driveway. Ultimately, they move it out of the driveway. They're lit up by Chris's brake lights as he's backing out of his driveway. And then you can use the Google location at 254 around 8th Avenue and 11th Street to show where Chris's phone was. The group then returns back to his house. Hours go by. And Detective Burrows, candidly, at that point, does not know what happens in that house other than what Dr. Burson had said.
Objection to this slide 403. Can we approach?
Yes.
So many objections, and it's still not clear what the relationship is between the three of them. Are they friends? Is one of them dating Chris? They talked about a ring. Was one of them engaged to him?
So he knows that Chris was stabbed 5 times in the neck, and he continues to watch the surveillance. And what was noted by initial officers, and what was noted by other people who look at this footage, knowing that they're looking at Chris's house and the surrounding area, is that ultimately one person comes out, goes down, and starts the car. And you'll hear from Detective Burrows after watching this multiple times that he notes that, yeah, this door opens. I see this figure consistent with the females. He differentiates from Chris, and he says, I see a female go, walk down, get in the car, but I didn't see 2. And approximately 3 minutes later, 3 minutes elapse, okay? And then a second figure comes out. Lights to the vehicle are shut off. Figure comes out, slowly, walks down, gets into the passenger side. And they drive away. Calmly. Now, the interesting thing for you is that at that same time that you just saw those 2 larger females leave that residence and drive away, that'll be captured on several videos, Chris's phone leaves too. The 2 females leave and drive away, and Chris's phone leaves. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to get to hear about those locations. And you'll get to use that in conjunction with Dr. Burson's testimony. Chris didn't die of being burnt. He died by being stabbed 5 times. So there's no way that at that point, he's just giving his phone to people he had just met that night. Because that's what will come out. Chris did not know these girls. He had met them in that alley. They had gone back to his place. They had taken his life. They had taken his ring. They had taken his phone, and they leave. And that will form the basis for the burglary. The initial burglary is for the theft of his phone, of the ring, and other items. But there's more. There's more. There's burglary that deals with arson and tampering with Chris's deceased body. And what you're going to hear is that after leaving at 5:12, they drive around for a period of time and they return. And when they return, they pull back into the neighborhood, pull outside of Chris's house. One individual on the passenger side calmly walks in, opens the front door to Mr. Dickerson's residence when he is dead, does whatever she does for a few minutes, and sets the place on fire. You'll see the return. It's a cul-de-sac, by the way. See him park. Slowly walk up. Open the door to a deceased Mr. Dickerson's house. Without authorization, without invitation, as he's likely laying there dead, having blood out. And approximately 2 minutes go by. You'll hear that no person was ever observed of getting out of the driver's seat. And 2 minutes later, you're going to see it, look at the window, and then watch the exit. Bright lights, flickering. Opening of the door, calmly walking down, getting into the car, and driving away. And the fire begins to go and go and go. You'll be able to look at those Google records, specifically see that lap, that Chris is on the ground, dead, but Chris's phone has made this lap, has returned to his residence, and leaves at the same time that vehicle leaves and drives off. And ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear a lot about technology in the city of Greeley, specifically about automatic license plate readers. And you're going to hear that at approximately 541 35th Avenue and 25th Street, that Malibu with the plate AER G95 is seen driving. And that location will matter because that connects all those dots. And that's used as an investigative tool for Detective Burrows. And that Google location that was provided by Mr. Dickerson continues to assist in that it shows that path. And ultimately, at approximately 6:13, looking at all the factors, Detective Burrows says something here based on automatic license plate readers and the path of travel. The car doesn't match anymore. And an automatic license plate reader is what it sounds like. It takes a picture of a person's plate, connects to registration, shows a time frame. It's a photo connected to a database. And so ultimately, Detective Burrows, who's very familiar with working auto cases, uses the location where he knows there'd be another automatic license plate reader and sees, hey, the timing works for this big Chevy Tahoe, plate CEB P61, and connects all those dots. Runs that registration, comes up with the people, starts looking at the two females that he had dealt with, and figures out who the two suspects are. Stacy Rodriguez, the defendant, and Hosanna Varela. And he continues to connect those dots, and ultimately, it progresses to make an arrest. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think a lot of the discussion detailed that we're going to be talking about self-defense. And you are to use reason and common sense in guiding you in that. You'll be provided the law. You'll be provided all the circumstances and facts. But you're also going to hear that on October 16th, nearly 2 weeks after this, there's an event that occurs. And keep in mind that these neighbors had been providing videos of what they captured, what they didn't. And you're going to hear that on October 16th at 7:46 a.m. on another ALPR in the 1700 block of 25th Street sees that Malibu. And Detective Burrows will be able to zoom in and opine that based on all the features, the earring, Miss Rodriguez's chin, a particular shirt she was wearing, that it's Miss Rodriguez. And ladies and gentlemen, you'll get to hear that at that same time, the footage that's being captured from those same residences catches that the defendant comes back to the scene of the crime. You'll see Mr. Dickerson's house. You'll see his windows boarded up after being burnt. She pulls right up by where she murdered somebody, stabbing him 5 times. You will get to think about a lot of concepts with self-defense. You're opposed to a lot of hypotheticals. This is reality. You will get the facts. You must use those facts. And ultimately, you'll get to decide how guilt and regret would ever play a factor. If you justifiably saved your own life, would you regret doing that? You're going to hear that on October 30th, 2021, when Detective Burrows writes for a variety of documents and databases that he gets the defendant's Facebook records. And he begins reading them. And again, at this point, he just has them as suspects. And he discovers this after the fact. Facebook is not quick. He goes through this process that you'll hear about, and he's still doing his investigation, and he orders them so that he captures things at a certain point. And what you're going to hear is that the defendant, on either the 29th or 30th of October, UTC, you'll hear about that, you subtract 6 hours. The defendant writes, "I think that thing I did is getting to me now." Like the guilt and regret. And I can't even talk to nobody about it. Could have talked to him. Could have talked to the Greeley Police Department. Nearly 27 days after Chris was stabbed 5 times. That's what's going to be discovered. The investigation continues. And on November 11th, 2021, the defendant is arrested, as well as Miss Varela. And ladies and gentlemen, if the defendant chooses not to testify, you all swore that you would not use that against her in any way, shape, or form. I trust you with that. But you will hear that she made statements on this date. And she denies it all. So in the text message before, she says, "I can't talk to anybody about this. This regret, this guilt." She had the chance on this day.
Gotcha. So we're working on a case. You mind if I talk to you for a couple minutes about it? Okay. Does this person look familiar? No. Okay. Have you ever seen him before? No. Okay. Okay. Have you ever been to 23? Correction. It's 2413 15th Avenue Court, Greeley. It's over off like by 25th Street, 11th Avenue. No, what's that? Well, it's a house. Okay. She doesn't believe she's ever been to the 2413 15th Avenue Court address. She doesn't know anybody who drives a silver Chevy Malibu. Is that right? And have you ever driven a Chevy Malibu?
Never been to the house, never seen Chris, never driven a Chevy Malibu, doesn't know anybody who does. And then she's told that she's being arrested.
Arson, burglary, and tampering is felony. Okay.
Is there proof of that?
Yes.
Her response, after all that time, is there proof of that? And you'll get to factor that into your consideration. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear again that Hosanna Varela was also arrested on that day, and you'll hear that she provided an interview with her lawyers present. And ladies and gentlemen, she outlines what she saw, what she heard. And you'll hear, confirming what we had from phone records, that they had not met before that point. She didn't know Chris. Stacy didn't know Chris. That's consistent with phone records because we never saw any interaction. That essentially just happened in that they were driving, Chris was walking, There's the discussion of going back to his place for an after party. And so they go back to his place, and he had some beer, he had some vodka. And according to Hosanna Varela, the defendant was giving him vodka while they were taking water, or part water. And you will get to ask yourself why that is, looking at all the circumstances. Why would you be feeding somebody an intoxicating substance that you weren't taking yourself? And make no mistake about it, that there's going to be a lot of blame cast on Christopher Dickerson. He was drunk. Very drunk. That's what his toxicology says. And he'll be blamed for that. And you'll get to decide if this was part of the plan. Hosanna Varela will make it very clear to you she never saw Christopher yielding a weapon. He never threatened to kill them, rape them, anything like that. That she doesn't recall any physical force by Chris. But is certain, no weapon, no threats, I'm going to kill you, nothing. And you'll hear that there was an argument, according to Hosanna, between Christopher Dickerson and the defendant. And ultimately, you're going to hear from Hosanna that according to her, Christopher was pushed. And then at some point, the defendant took a beer bottle over to him and smashed it on him. And that Christopher Dickerson was yelling for them to leave, pleading with them to leave. Ms. Varela will say, and has said, that she wasn't afraid that night of being hurt, that they could have left. There wasn't a hypothetical door. There was a real door. There wasn't a hypothetical car. It was theirs. It's parked outside. You'll hear the progression. And you'll hear that Hosanna Varela asked her to stop and leave. And you'll hear during the testimony of her that according to her previous statement, she had seen this object, the murder weapon, at Chris's house that was out, that it looked like a file of sort. She describes it as something that would be like used to sharpen knives. There was a handle. She thought it had white tape, wasn't certain, but she saw it. And ultimately, she put it underneath. But she says there was no need to kill him. There was no need. And yet Stacy Rodriguez did. She'll describe what that sounded like. She'll talk about seeing Chris bleeding out. Describes a death gargle. She'll describe that immediately after, Stacy seemed happy about it. And that instead of calling for 911 or anything like that, what was the first thing that Stacy Rodriguez started doing? She started going through his stuff. Opening cupboards, going into his room. So ladies and gentlemen, ultimately, You'll get the law as instructed in the end, and you will get to determine whether or not you believe it was reasonable. And was there a need for this imminent use of force to defend herself with no weapon, and that had to occur right then when a person was yelling to get out of my house? A reasonable belief, in order to have justified self-defense, you have to reasonably believe lesser force is just not going to cut it in this circumstance. You will get to determine those items as to what was reasonable, what was necessary, and what was appropriate. And there had to be this reasonable belief that there's imminent danger of being killed or receiving this injury. You'll hear the progression that the defendant asked her. In this progression, after the beer bottles, go get the weapon. You'll get to think about that. Deliberate, intentional action of asking for that. And Hosanna did. She'll detail all of that for you. What she heard, what she saw, and you'll hear, according to Hosanna, that then the defendant was moved. You'll hear that she was told to go out and start the car. The video will corroborate that. She discussed that items were taken. She will discuss driving off and then returning, staying in the car, and that the fire was lit. And ladies and gentlemen, they will blame her for all of this. Taking a deal with the devil. For witnessing this horrific murder. Receiving 32 years in the Department of Corrections. You'll get to decide who was the initial aggressor. Hearing that testimony, looking at the testimony, the actions after, the evidence of flight, and the defendant's multiple statements after the fact. And you'll get to compare what those statements looked like between those two girls. And you had been told that they were arrested. And while at jail, you'll hear that Hosanna got a note written on paper towel. And I know it might be hard for you to see. You'll get this exhibit, but I'll read it to you. I hope you kept the same story. You ain't dumb. I know they gonna trick you, but if you ain't see or do or hear anything, you're cool. You know, don't give in to they shit. Hang in there, babe. You'll be out soon. I just need to see how not to dig myself deeper. I know it's baby Joker's fault. It probably crossed your mind to say stuff, but then you going down too. Don't be stupid. Play dumb. It's all good, Turbo Muffler. LOL. You'll hear that in reference to this, I know it's baby Joker's fault, that's what the defendant calls herself. When she's referring to her as babe, you'll get to hear about Stacy and Hosanna's relationship. You'll get to hear that Hosanna had previously been in a relationship with a man she had 3 children with. And that the fire just wasn't there anymore in that relationship. And that Hosanna and Stacy had worked together, and Stacy was showing her all of this attention that was missing from her husband at home. And at a certain point, that relationship became sexual. You'll hear on that video when they're arrested, do you know? How do you guys know each other? Yeah, we're definitely more than friends. Would you call yourself a couple? Yeah, I mean, yeah. And you'll hear the messages between them. Hang in there, babe. You'll be out soon. I know it's Baby Joker's fault. The same person that writes at the bottom of that letter, provided in jail to flush. That's what the evidence will be. And ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear that was not justifiable, that was not reasonable, that was not necessary. It was vicious, it was violent. And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, you will know that Chris's death, his death in that living room, was only first-degree murder, followed by burglary, by stealing his stuff, followed by burglary for arson, and tampering with a deceased body. And I trust that after using all your reason, all your common sense, those will be the verdicts that you render. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and take our morning recess at this time.
All right, so they actually ended up showing a picture of Chris, but I pulled a couple photos because, like we were kind of saying in the chat, if you Google this trial in this case, there is not a lot of information. There's been a couple of these trials this last week that have had no information. They've been super quick trials. One of them lasted 2 to 3 days. I mean, it's been a little bit crazy. So here's one picture of him, and here's another. They go for a long break, so I'm gonna hop over and start the Monica Cementelli trial. They started late. That is not a surprise. That's how their entire trial has gone this whole time. So I will be over there. We will finish this entire trial in just a couple hours. I'll be back on for it, and we will be able to skip over their big breaks and watch it all. All right, thanks for watching.